On the afternoon of August 9th, 1966, a North Vietnamese officer named Lam watched an American die in the open. Then he watched a second American go out into the same fire to bring the first one back. The first man had been hit crossing a rice paddy. He went down in the mud, in the open, in a field that Lam's machine guns had ranged hours before. There was no cover out there. There was no reason to believe anyone could reach him and live. Lam had seen this 100 times. A man caught in the open like that was already dead. And the only question was how long it would take. The sensible thing, the thing Lam's own soldiers would have done, was to leave him and to grieve him later from cover. The Americans did not leave him. A single soldier came out of the tree line at a low, fast crouch. Lam could not know his name was Michael Alvarez, 21, from El Paso, a medic the other men simply called Doc. He was not carrying a rifle. He was carrying a canvas bag. He ran straight into the open field that Lam's guns owned, and he did not stop when the fire found the ground around him. And he reached the fallen man and knelt over him in the mud as though the bullets were rain. Lam's gunners fired at him. Of course they did. And they missed, or they hit near enough to kill any ordinary luck, and still the medic worked. After what felt like a very long time, he got the wounded man up across his shoulders and stood and carried him out of that field, slow and bent and impossibly upright, back toward the trees, through fire that should have killed them both a dozen times. Lam was left with a hard question, and it stayed with him for years. Not how the medic had lived. Luck could explain that. The question was why he had gone at all. Why send a second man to die for a man already lost? It made no military sense. By every rule Lam fought by, it was a mistake. It would take him a long time to understand that it was not a mistake at all. It was the most important thing the Americans did. And it was a large part of the reason he could never beat them. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand why one enemy officer spent years puzzling over a thing that looked like a simple mistake, you first have to understand why it was not a mistake, and you have to understand what the Americans knew that Lam did not. On a battlefield, the wounded are a problem. That sounds cold, and it is. But war is cold, and every army in history has had to reckon with the same hard arithmetic. A wounded man cannot fight. He cannot move himself. He takes other men out of the fight to carry him, to treat him, to guard him. In pure military terms, a badly wounded soldier is a drain on the very force that is trying to survive. The coldest calculation says that the living should not be spent to recover the dying, and that the dead should not be recovered at all while the fight is still on. Most armies, through most of history, have fought by something close to that calculation, not because their soldiers were heartless, but because the alternative got even more men killed. The North Vietnamese army was brave, and it was devoted, and it cared for its own, but it was also realistic in a way that a poorer, weaker force has to be. When the fire was too heavy, the NVA left their wounded and their dead where they fell, and they came back for them later if they could, in the dark, when it was safe. They mourned them. They did not throw living men after them into a killing zone. That was not cowardice. It was arithmetic. And it was the arithmetic Lam had lived by his entire career. So when Lam watched the Americans again and again do the opposite of that arithmetic, it genuinely confused him. And it was not a rare thing he was seeing. It was constant. Wherever American soldiers fought, the same pattern appeared. A man went down, and other men, sometimes one, sometimes many, went into the fire to get him. They did it for the badly wounded who might still be saved. They did it, incredibly, for men who were almost certainly already dead. They would spend an hour and risk a squad to recover a single body from ground the enemy controlled. To Lam, this was not just strange. It looked like a flaw. It looked like a weakness he could use. And at first, he tried to use it. It was too obvious a thing to ignore. Every officer on his side saw the same pattern and drew the same conclusion. If the Americans will always come for their fallen, then their fallen are a lever. You pull it by putting a man down and waiting. It was taught. It was planned for. It became a standard piece of how his army fought the Americans up close. For a long time, Lam believed it was simply good tactics, a way to turn the enemy's sentiment into a killing ground. He did not yet see the flaw in his own thinking. The flaw was that he had called it sentiment. It was not sentiment. It was something much harder and much more dangerous, and it did not break when you leaned on it. It pushed back. Because think about it from his side of the line. If your enemy will always, predictably, come for his wounded, then his wounded are bait. Wound one American in the open, and you do not have one target. You have every American who's about to crawl out after him. This was not a theory. It became a tactic, and the NVA and the Viet Cong used it deliberately. Shoot to wound, not to kill, and then wait, guns trained on the open ground, for the rescuers who were certain to come. It was a cruel and effective idea, and it worked, and it cost American units dearly, and the Americans kept coming anyway. That was the part Lam could not fit into his picture. They knew it was a trap. They walked into it regardless, over and over. An officer who sees his enemy do something self-destructive again and again eventually has to ask whether he is misunderstanding it. And Lam, to his credit, was a thinker as well as a soldier. He began to suspect slowly that he was looking at the wrong thing. He had been looking at the wounded man and asking why anyone would die for him. But maybe the wounded man was not the point. Maybe the men going out to get him were not doing it for him at all. Or not only for him, maybe they were doing it for a reason Lam had not yet learned to see. Working out what that reason was would take Lam most of the war, and it would change how he understood the entire American army, and why in the end it could not be broken the way he had been taught that armies break. To understand the thing Lam was watching, you have to start with one particular kind of American soldier. Not a rifleman, not an officer. The one man in the platoon who, when everyone else was trained to take cover, was trained to run toward the screaming. The combat medic. The man the others called Doc. The medic was, in a strange way, the heart of the American infantry platoon, and he occupied a place unlike anyone else in it. He was usually young, often barely 20. He carried a bag instead of the load of ammunition the others carried, though he carried a weapon too when he could. His job, when the shooting started and every instinct in the human body screamed to get down and stay down, was to do the opposite. When a man was hit and went down and started to call out, the medic's job was to get up and go to him across whatever ground lay between them, no matter what was crossing that ground at the time. He ran to the wounded. That was the entire job, and the men around him loved him for it in a way that is hard to explain to anyone who has not needed one. Because every rifleman in that platoon carried a private, unspoken terror. Not just the fear of being killed, the fear of being hit and left, and dying slowly and alone in the mud while the fight moved on without him. The medic was the answer to that terror. As long as Doc was alive and near, a wounded man was not alone. Someone would come. Someone whose whole purpose was to come. That knowledge was worth more to a platoon's morale than an extra machine gun, and every experienced soldier knew it. The medic was not just a man who patched wounds. He was the living proof of a promise the whole unit made to itself, that if you fall, you will not be left. Michael Alvarez was one of these men, and there were thousands like him. He had not wanted to be a medic especially. The Army had made him one. But somewhere in the training and the fear and the first terrible day he spent trying to keep a 19-year-old alive with his own hands, the job had become the thing he was. He was not fearless. Medics were almost never fearless. The good ones were often the most frightened men in the unit because they understood better than anyone what the wounds looked like. Alvarez was afraid every single time. He went anyway. Every single time. That was the whole of it. The courage was not the absence of fear. It was the decision, made again and again, to move toward the men who needed him while every cell in his body begged him to stay down. There was one day he rarely spoke about afterward. A patrol was caught in the open. 3 men went down at once. The fire was so heavy that the rest of the platoon lay flat and could not lift their heads. Alvarez went out into it. He reached the first man and found him already gone. He did not stop to grieve. There was no time. He crawled to the second, a boy from Ohio with a torn leg pumping bright blood into the dirt. Alvarez knelt over him in the open, in the middle of it, and got both hands on the wound and pressed. He held it, and he talked to the kid the whole time, low and steady, about nothing at all. About baseball, about home, about the beer they would drink when this was over. He got a tourniquet on. He got the boy back. Rounds cracked past both of them the entire time, and he never once looked up from the wound to see where they were coming from. His whole world had shrunk to a leg and a boy, and the job of keeping the blood inside him. That was the job. That was every day. And the enemy knew about the medic too. This is the part that says something dark about that war. Under the rules of war, a medic wearing the Red Cross was not supposed to be a target. He was there to save life, and the conventions of civilized warfare protected him. But in the jungle, those conventions often did not hold. Both sides came to understand that killing the medic was, in cold tactical terms, one of the most effective things you could do. Kill the medic. And you did not just remove one man. You removed the platoon's answer to its deepest fear. You took away the promise. So the medics learned to take the red crosses off their helmets because the cross had become a bullseye. They went out to the wounded anyway, unmarked now, hunted like everyone else, and more, because everyone on both sides understood how much they were worth. Picture what the job actually looked like. On a bad day, a firefight erupts. A man is hit out ahead of the line in the open. He is screaming, or worse, he has gone quiet. The medic is 40 meters back, behind cover, in the one place a sane man would want to be, and he leaves it. He crawls, or he runs bent double, out across ground that is alive with fire, to reach a man he may not be able to save, carrying a bag that will not stop a single bullet. He reaches him. He kneels in the open. And then, with rounds cracking past his head, he does careful, delicate, two-handed work, stopping bleeding, clearing an airway, pushing a needle, talking low and steady to a terrified boy, as though the two of them were somewhere safe, as though the war had agreed to wait. That was what Lamb had watched in the rice paddy. That was Doc, and multiplied across the whole American army. It was one of the reasons that army was so much harder to break than it had any right to be. Reaching the wounded man was only half of it. The other half was getting him out. And getting a wounded man out of a firefight is one of the hardest, most exhausting, most dangerous things a human being can do, and the Americans did it constantly, and the doing of it is where the real story lives. A grown man is heavy. A grown man who cannot help you, who is limp or thrashing or curled around a wound, is much heavier still. Now add his gear and the mud and the heat and the exhaustion of a man who has already been fighting. Now put him on ground that is being swept by fire, so that carrying him upright means being shot, which means you must drag him or crawl with him, or throw him across your shoulders and run bent nearly double under his weight. There is a reason the firemen's carry and the drag and the two-man haul were drilled into American soldiers until they could do them half-conscious. Because when the moment came, it always came in the worst possible conditions, and it always had to be done fast, and it always cost. And here is what the enemy watched and could not get used to. The Americans did not do this reluctantly as a grim duty forced on them. They did it as though it were the most natural thing in the world, as though leaving a man were simply not among the available options. A soldier would drag his wounded friend 100 meters through fire, take a wound himself doing it, and never once appear to consider stopping. When one man carrying the wounded went down, another took the load, and another after that. Lamb saw a single wounded American cost the lives of 2, 3, 4 men who died trying to bring him in, and still more men came to try. To his arithmetic, this was madness. Each rescuer lost was a soldier who could have kept fighting. The books he had learned his trade from would have called it a catastrophic waste. There is one story that stands for 1,000 like it. A soldier watched his closest friend go down in a tree line, badly hit. Between them lay 30 meters of open ground that a machine gun owned. Everyone who could see it knew what crossing that ground meant. He went anyway. He low-crawled the first stretch, got up, ran the rest, bent double, and reached his friend alive. He could not carry him upright. The gun would have cut them both down. So he took the drag strap on the back of the man's harness and hauled him backward, on his knees, one heave at a time. 30 meters, under fire, for what felt like an hour, and was probably 4 minutes. He took a round through the shoulder halfway across. He kept hauling. He got his friend to the trees, and both of them lived. Neither of them ever thought it was remarkable. It was just what you did. But the books assumed something that was not true of these men. The books assumed a soldier fights only as long as fighting serves his survival and stops when the cost gets too high. These Americans did not stop when the cost got too high because they were not doing the calculation the books assumed. They had a different rule, and the rule was older and simpler than any manual. You do not leave your people, not the wounded, not the dead. You bring them home. It did not matter that it was expensive. It was not a policy that could be argued with on grounds of efficiency, because efficiency was not what it was for. This is exactly why the enemy's bait tactic, as cruel and clever as it was, never actually worked the way it was supposed to. Yes, the NVA could wound a man in the open and kill the rescuers who came. They did it many times, but it never broke the pattern. The Americans learned that a wounded man in the open was probably bait, and they went anyway. They got smarter about how suppressing fire, smoke, a rush by several men at once instead of one, but they never stopped going. And that refusal turned the enemy's own tactics sour in a way Lamb only understood slowly. Because when you build your ambush around the certainty that your enemy will come for his wounded, you have just told your enemy exactly where you are and exactly what you are about to do. And you have committed your guns to a killing ground that they are about to assault with everything they have, in a fury that a mere firefight never produced. More than once, the bait ambush ended with the ambushers overrun, because there is nothing on earth quite as dangerous as American infantry that has just watched a friend used as bait. Lamb watched this happen to another officer's ambush, and it taught him a lesson he never lost. The trap was perfect. The bait worked. The rescuers came, and the guns opened, and for a moment it was exactly the killing the ambush had promised. And then the Americans refused to do the dying part. They came through the fire, screaming straight up the hill at the guns. They were into the positions before the gunners could fire more than a belt. The ambush became a slaughter of the ambushers. The officer who set that trap did not survive to regret it. Lamb did. He filed it away with all the other lessons this enemy kept teaching him at such a price. So the carry was not weakness. Though it looked like weakness, it was the physical proof of the thing that held the American infantry together. Every time a soldier shouldered a wounded friend and staggered out of the fire with him, every other man watching was learning the same lesson deep in the place where courage is kept. That is what happens to you here if you fall. Someone comes, someone carries you out. You will not be left in the mud. And a man who believes that, really believes it, because he has seen it with his own eyes over and over, is a man who can be asked to do almost anything. There was one more piece to it, and it was the piece that turned a promise into a near certainty. And it came from the sky, because carrying a wounded man out of the fire only bought him minutes. What those minutes were worth depended on what came next, and what came next in Vietnam was something no army in the history of war had ever been able to offer its wounded before. It was the helicopter. Specifically, the medical evacuation helicopter and the men who flew it, and the single radio word that became one of the most beautiful sounds a wounded American could hear. Dust off. When a man was hit, and his friends had gotten him back to some scrap of open ground, someone would get on the radio and call for dust off, and out of the sky, often within minutes, would come an unarmed helicopter to carry him away, not to an aid station down the road, but to a full surgical hospital, sometimes within the hour of his wounding. Understand how revolutionary that was. In every previous war, a badly wounded soldier faced a long, jolting, agonizing journey to the rear, measured in hours or days, and a great many men who could have been saved died on the way. The helicopter collapsed that journey from days into minutes. A man hit in a paddy at noon could be on a surgeon's table before his blood had time to run out. The survival numbers this produced were staggering, unlike anything before. A wounded American who was still alive when the dust-off lifted off had an extraordinary chance of living, because the thing that had killed so many of his father's and grandfather's time had been taken out of the equation. The promise was no longer just, "We will carry you out." The promise had become, "We will carry you out and get you to a surgeon, and you will probably live." But the helicopter had to come down to get him, and coming down was where the courage lived. A medevac helicopter is a large, slow, loud, fragile thing, and to pick up wounded, it has to descend into a small clearing, hover, and sit there, often in the exact spot where men are being wounded, which is to say, in the middle of the fight. It is, in that moment, the biggest and easiest target on the battlefield, and it is unarmed, marked, in theory, by a red cross that the enemy had every reason to ignore. The men who flew these missions went down into hot landing zones again and again, into fire that sent them home riddled with holes, because somewhere below them was a man who would die if they did not. From the ground, the arrival of a dust-off was something the men who saw it never forgot. You have a dying friend, a patch of smoke-marked grass, and a radio. And then, over the trees, comes the sound, the heavy beat of the rotors, growing impossibly out of the same sky the enemy fire is coming from. The ship drops into the clearing and sits there, shuddering, enormous, while the world tries to kill it. The crew chief leans out the door and waves you in. You carry your friend to it at a dead run and heave him aboard, and the medic inside has his hands on him before you have even let go. Then the ship claws back up into the air, taking your friend toward a surgeon and a chance. And you go back to your fight a little lighter, because the worst of it is out of your hands now, and in better ones. Men wept at the sight of those helicopters. Hard men. Because a dust-off coming down was hope with a rotor blade, and they knew exactly what it was worth. The most famous of them has a name worth saying, because he was real, and because his words became the creed of everyone who flew after him. Major Charles Kelly commanded a medical detachment early in the war, and he flew into places that other men would not, and he set the standard by refusing to leave wounded behind, no matter the fire. In July of 1964, over a hot landing zone, ordered to get his aircraft out of danger, Kelly gave the answer that dust-off crews would carry for the rest of the war. He said he would leave when he had their wounded. Moments later, he was killed. But the thing he said outlived him. and it became the promise the whole medevac service was built on, the same promise the medic and the carry had already made on the ground, now made from the air. We will come. We will not leave you. When we have your wounded, then we will go, and not 1 second before. The men who flew Dustoff paid for that promise. Their aircraft came home shredded or did not come home at all. Descending slow and unarmed into the exact place where men were being shot was among the most dangerous things a person could do in that war. The crews knew the odds better than anyone. They flew anyway. Night missions in bad weather, into landing, zones still hot with fire, because on the other end of every one of those radio calls was a voice, and a man attached to the voice, running out of time. You do not leave a man to die because the flying is dangerous. That was the whole idea. That was the entire point of the thing. For the enemy, the Dustoff helicopter was both a target and a torment. Lamb and men, like him, learned that the medevac ships would always come, and so, like the wounded man in the open, the medevac became bait, a way to draw an aircraft into a prepared killing zone. And the crews knew it, and came anyway. There was that phrase again, that maddening, unbreakable phrase playing out now in 3 dimensions. The enemy could make the coming as costly as they liked. They could not make it stop. Here is the thing Lamb finally understood, after years of watching it, and it reorganized everything he thought he knew about the men he was fighting. He had been asking the wrong question from the very first day in the rice paddy. He had been asking why the Americans would spend so much to save one wounded man. That was never the real question, because it was never really about the one wounded man. It was about all the others. Think about what every American rifleman knew in the marrow of his bones every time he was ordered to do something that might get him killed. He knew that if he was hit, a medic would come for him through the fire no matter what. He knew that his friends would carry him out, and that they would keep carrying him even if it cost them, because he had watched them do exactly that for other men. He knew that if they could get him to a clearing, a helicopter would drop out of the sky into the middle of the battle to take him to a surgeon, and that he would probably live. He knew all of this not as a hope, but as a near certainty, because he had seen it happen again and again with his own eyes. And that knowledge changed what could be asked of him, because a man who believes he will be abandoned if he falls fights carefully. He hedges. He keeps something back for himself, some margin of self-preservation, because in the end he knows he is on his own. But a man who believes absolutely that he will not be left behind, that whatever happens, his people will come for him. That man can give everything. He can cross the open ground. He can take the point. He can charge the gun. Because the worst thing, the thing under all the other fears, the fear of being hit and left alone to die in the mud, has been taken off the table. Someone will come. Someone always comes. And so he is free to fight in a way that a more sensible, more abandoned man never could. You can see the whole logic of it in one small, ordinary moment, repeated 1,000,000 times across that war. A sergeant tells a young rifleman to move to a spot that means crossing open ground under fire. The kid is terrified. Everyone is always terrified, but he goes. And part of the reason his legs will move is a thing he never says out loud. He simply knows it. If the worst happens out there, he will not be left out there. Doc will come. His friends will come. The helicopter will come. He is not crossing that ground alone, even though he is the only man on it, because the whole weight of the promise is crossing it with him. Take the promise away, and the kid does not move. Keep it, and he does. Multiply that one moment by every soldier in every fight of that long war, and you have the difference between an army that hesitates and an army that does not. That was the secret. That was the whole secret. And it was hiding in plain sight the entire time, disguised as a weakness. The enormous effort the Americans poured into recovering their wounded and their dead was not a drain on their fighting power. It was the source of it. Every medic who ran into the open, every soldier who carried a friend out through fire, every helicopter crew that descended into a hot landing zone, all of it was constantly, visibly, expensively renewing a single promise to every man still fighting. We will come for you. And that promise was worth more than any weapon because it was the thing that let ordinary, frightened, homesick men do extraordinary things over and over for years. There was a fight, late in Lamb's war, that made him certain of it. His unit had pinned an American company in a bad position and wounded a number of them. And by his old arithmetic, the Americans should have been paralyzed, half their strength tied up in caring for casualties, their attention split, their nerve failing. Instead, he watched the opposite happen. The wounded were pulled to the center and worked on and kept alive. The medevac was called, and the rest of the company, far from being paralyzed, fought with a cohesion and a fury that his ambush could not contain, precisely because they were not afraid for their wounded. They knew their wounded were being cared for. They knew the helicopters were coming, so they were free to turn all of their attention outward onto Lamb, and they broke his grip and got everyone out, the living, the wounded, and the dead. Every one of them. And Lamb understood, watching those helicopters lift away with the last of the casualties, that he had never been fighting men who were afraid of being left behind, because these men had built a world in which being left behind did not happen. He had been trying to break their nerve by threatening the one thing they had made themselves immune to. Sit with how strange that is. Every weapon Lamb had was built, in the end, to do one thing, to make the enemy afraid enough to stop. Fear was the real target of all of it. The artillery, the ambushes, the bait in the open field, and these Americans had found a way to take their deepest fear and answer it permanently with a promise they kept in blood every single day. They had not made themselves brave by pretending not to be afraid. They had made themselves brave by building a world in which the worst fear could not come true. You cannot frighten men out of a fight when they have already faced down the thing you are trying to frighten them with. Lamb had spent his best years aiming at a nerve that was no longer there. Lamb survived the war. He grew old in a country at peace, and like a great many old soldiers, he spent a good part of his last years turning over the things he had seen and trying, finally, to understand them. And of all the things about the Americans that had puzzled and frustrated and cost him, the one he came back to most was the simplest one: the way they refused to leave their people behind. He had been taught to see it as a weakness, and he had tried for years to use it as one. And it had never quite worked, and in the end, he understood why. It was not a weakness at all. It was the visible surface of the thing that made the American infantry so stubborn and so dangerous. He came to believe that his own side had misjudged it badly. The propaganda had said the Americans were soft, that they fought only for their machines and their comforts, that they did not have the stomach for real sacrifice. But Lamb had watched American soldiers make sacrifices that his propaganda said they were incapable of, dying, freely and repeatedly, not for territory or victory, but simply to bring one of their own out of the fire. That was not softness. It was a kind of devotion he recognized, because it was not so different from the devotion his own best soldiers had shown, and he had never respected an enemy's devotion more than he did theirs. He remembered one thing a captured American had said to him through an interpreter that stayed with him for good. Lamb had asked the man why his people spent so much to recover the dead, not the wounded, who might still be saved, but the dead who were beyond all saving. The American looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "They did it so that every man still alive would know he would never be left behind. Alive or dead, it did not matter. They carried the dead home, the man said, so that the living would not be afraid. Lamb had never heard it put so plainly. He never forgot it. It was, he thought, the whole thing in a single sentence. He noticed, too, the same thing that puzzled everyone who fought the Americans closely. They did not seem to think what they were doing was remarkable. Lamb had questioned prisoners who had done extraordinary things to save their friends, and to a man they were baffled to be asked about it. They had gone back for their buddy. What kind of a question was that? Of course they had gone back. You always went back. It was not heroism to them, not something they had reached for. It was simply the water they swam in, the unspoken law of the world they lived in, so deep that they could not see it as a choice. And Lamb came to think that this was the most powerful part of all, that the promise was so total, so completely woven into who these men were, that they no longer even experienced it as a promise. It was just the truth. You do not leave your people. And an army that believes that, all the way down, is an army with no back door, no breaking point in the place where breaking points are supposed to be. The wounded man in the rice paddy, the one from that first afternoon in 1966, Lamb never learned whether he lived. He never learned the medic's name. He remembered the two of them, though, for the rest of his life. The one man down in the mud, and the other man running out into the guns to get him, bent under his weight on the way back, refusing to be sensible, refusing to leave. Lamb had spent that afternoon thinking he was watching a mistake. He spent the rest of his life understanding he had been watching the enemy's greatest strength in its purest and simplest form. Here is what the enemy finally understood about the American soldiers who carried their wounded out of fire that no one should have survived. They had spent years trying to use it as a weakness, and in the end, they learned it was the opposite of a weakness, and the learning came too late to matter. Every army in history has had to answer the same brutal question. What do you do about the men who fall? And most armies, out of hard necessity, have given some version of the same answer. You save who you can, you leave who you must, and you do not throw the living after the lost. It is a sane answer. It is a survivable answer. The Americans gave a different one, and on paper it was the worse answer, the more expensive answer, the one that got extra men killed. They decided they would go back. Every time. For the wounded, for the dying, for the dead. Whatever it cost. And that decision, which looked like sentiment, which looked like a flaw an enemy could exploit, turned out to be one of the hardest, shrewdest, most powerful things about the way they fought. Because it was never really about the man they were carrying. It was about every other man watching them carry him. Every medic who ran into the open, every soldier bent double under a wounded friend, every helicopter that fell out of the sky into the middle of a battle, was making the same promise to every American still in the fight, and renewing it in blood over and over. If you fall, we come. You will not be left. And that promise did something no weapon could do. It took the deepest fear a soldier carries, the fear of dying alone and abandoned in the mud, and it removed it. And a man with that fear removed is a man who can be asked to walk into anything. That is why the enemy's cleverest tactic, using the wounded as bait, never truly worked. You cannot exploit a man's refusal to abandon his friends by making it more expensive, because he was never doing the math in the first place. You can only kill him for it, and watch the next man do the same thing, and the next, until you begin to understand that you are not fighting an army that can be frightened into breaking. You are fighting an army that made itself a promise and kept it, no matter what it cost, and grew unbreakable in the keeping. That is a strange and almost beautiful thing to find at the center of something as ugly as a war. Strip away everything else, the politics, the maps, the arguments about why they were even there, which a great many of them never believed in. What is left in the mud at the worst moment is a group of frightened young men who had decided they would not leave each other, not alive, not dead, not for anything. It cost them terribly, and they paid it without hesitation, and it made them, in the one place it mattered most, impossible to defeat. They were not doing something they thought was extraordinary. They would have told you, every one of them, that they were just going back for their buddy and that anyone would have done the same. They were wrong that anyone would have done the same. But they were right that it was simple. A soldier who knows they will come back for him will walk into any fire on earth. That was the secret. The enemy spent a whole war trying to turn it into a weakness and never could, because it was the strongest thing on that battlefield. Now you know why. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping, not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the quiet, impossible things ordinary men did for each other in the worst places on earth, on both sides of the wire. If it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in Vietnam, a medic, a door gunner, a rifleman, anyone in any unit, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.